I'm awfully sorry. Thank you for the invitation, and I feel very honored to speak to you tonight about Norman MacCaig, a man I became friends with. Norman MacCaig was born in 1910 and died in 1966, whom I had the pleasure of meeting, interviewing, and befriending over the years while I was writing my dissertation, a monography of his work consisting of more than 600 poems. This eminent 20th century Scottish poet was a recipient of the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry and is featured in school curricula across Great Britain, yet remains relatively unknown internationally. I had the pleasure of meeting, interviewing, and I've said it already, I'm sorry. My talk will focus on Norman MacCaig's life and work, providing an outline of the three phases of his oeuvre, exemplified through readings of some of his poems. However, I will begin by explaining how it all began, how I met the poet and his work in 1986. Allow me first to share how I came across Scottish poetry. After studying at the University of Edinburgh during my year abroad in 1982 to 83, I felt obliged to attend a reading of contemporary Scottish poetry at Johannes Gutenberg University in Mainz. The poets had been on a reading tour organized by the Scottish Poetry Library in August 1985, or perhaps it was in winter. I found myself listening to poems read by Joy Henry, Angus MacNicol, and others in a somber lecture hall at my university. As I was searching for a topic for my final thesis Staatsexamen, I decided to focus on those contemporary Scottish poets. I approached my professor for guidance, and he recommended Norman MacCaig's poetry. I had never heard of him, but upon finding a few poems in King's anthology, 12 Modern Scottish Poets, I immediately liked them. After a futile search for more of his work in our libraries, as it was back in those days before the World Wide Web, I was delighted to have a valid excuse to return to Scotland, a country I had grown fond of. In August 1986, I arrived at the Scottish Poetry Library in Tweeder Court in its early stages, armed with a leaflet gathered at their previous reading in Mainz. I entered one big room filled with books, papers, and enthusiasm, and was warmly welcomed by Tessa Ransford, the director, and Tom Hubbard, the librarian, both of whom helped me access to MacCaig's poetry, as his collected poems had just been released. Day by day, one could find me sitting at the round table at the back of the library, usually with a cup of tea, behind a pile of books and papers, often chatting with visitors who had come to town for the festival. As I read through the collected poems, I was astonished to encounter a lot of people who had known Norman at various stages in his life, as a child, a schoolboy, a teacher, at university, or as a friend of Hugh McDermott. Some had met him in a pub. One even knew his mother. Was he so well known that nearly everyone seemed to know him? All these stories about MacCaig made me want to know the man himself. But I was a bit afraid to meet the poet. It felt like the wish to meet Goethe in person. I took the bold step of writing him a letter requesting an interview, with a couple of questions in a proper order. I viewed myself as rather brave, or perhaps naive, as at the time I knew little about his poetry. What was worse, I had read some interviews with MacCaig, which revealed his sharp tongue and witty phrases, which could ridicule any clever question. Moreover, I knew of his strict division between a scholar who wants to know everything and an academic whom he would refer to as the Dickens man and whom he despised. I posted the letter, and as time was twirling by, I filled my days happily reading poems and meeting people, enjoying the festival. As my departure date drew near and I had yet to receive a response from the poet, one morning Tessa inquired, "Did Norman respond?" My negative reply surprised her, and she suggested phoning him. So she called, and suddenly there he was, the subject of my studies, on the phone. I heard his deep voice in his particular slow yet careful stress on every word for the first time. I was extremely nervous, but he was kind and mentioned that he had just returned from the north and hadn't had time to respond to my letter yet. I knew he usually spent the summer month in Lochinver, Sutherland. Many of his poems are about this region, many, as he calls them, snapshot poems, which celebrate the moment, the landscape, or climbing Sylvan, his favorite mountain. But back to our first phone call. He said I would be welcome to come along with a tape recorder for an interview. We arranged a date in his flat in Edinburgh. On the appointed day, you could see a very excited student walking across the meadows on the way to his flat in Leamington Terrace, with a borrowed tape recorder under her arm, wondering how it would be. A tall man with distinct facial features opened the door and asked me in. Oops. He introduced me to his wife and said he would only have half an hour, which made it quite clear that this was going to be a real interview. The interview began. He had the letter with a list of my questions straight in front of him, which we worked through. I knew my place. So he gave me answers, and he told me about his Gallic ancestry, his love of accuracies and strict form, the importance of honesty in art, his spontaneity in writing his short poems. As he said, I quote, I write short poems. I can't be bothered reading long ones. Who can? Time was flying. We laughed. Very soon the room was covered with the heavy smoke of cigarettes. I usually don't smoke, but that day I smoked like a chimney, all the cigarettes he offered me, and he smoked a lot, as usual. When he went off to get a bottle of whiskey, I knew I had won this round. We had a first dram and a few were to follow. It was the best interview ever. When the list of questions of my letter were answered, I had prepared some extra ones, more personal ones. But he resisted giving an answer. Tension was in the air, but passed quickly. We carried on talking, and all of a sudden time was up. Now he excused himself for having another appointment, and so I had to go. I walked away feeling like I was floating half in a dream and very happy with my first interview. Two others were to follow at a much later and more advanced stages of my studies, yet this first one was the best. A few days later, I left Scotland and I wrote my final thesis on his work at Mainz University. Then I was asked to carry on by writing a PhD on his poetry. So for a long time, I had the good excuse of coming to Scotland for doing research here. I've become friends with a lot of his friends, and Edinburgh has turned more and more into something like my second home. Until today, something seems to drag me back to Scotland and to its lovely people. In the course of the years between August 1987 and August 1995, we developed our routine of seeing each other. I never said I was coming back. He knew I always would. As soon as I had arrived in Edinburgh, I gave him a call and had to wait until his distinct voice said, "Hello." I just informed him, "Here's Annette speaking, I'm back." And he answered, "Wait, I get my diary." And so we usually met by 11 o'clock in the morning and sat down in his living room, a name well equipped for a room full of books, with a piano and pictures and paintings on the wall, a room which could tell stories of a long and happy life, as Norman always described it. We had a cup of tea. Isabel, his wife, would give us some food. It was followed by the occasional wee dram, as he used to call it, and he loved his whiskey, particularly Talisker or Lefroy, very much. A question of mind would spark off our conversation, and from then on time would flow. For instance, when I asked Norman about a pibroch, he explained, I quote from this first interview mostly, if not, I shall say so. It is transcribed in the appendix of my PhD dissertation. You can hear it at the Scottish Poetry Library. But back to Norman. He said, I quote, the greatest music to my taste is a certain type of bagpipe music. It was composed about 120, 130 years ago. Then it died out. It is a form called pibroch. Each pibroch is in the form of theme and variations. The variations follow strict rules. Every variation follows strict rules of that kind of variation. When pipers are playing in piping competitions, they say, oh, he fluffed a crazed note in the third movement there. No chance. Out you go. An almost pedantic respect for strict forms is the sort of thing I also have. End of quote. Music was immensely significant to him. He compared it to poetry, stating, it's closest to music. He had me listen to some of his favorite pieces, works of Bach, Beethoven, Scarlatti, among others. Yet he had a disdain for romanticism, also in music. He loved Ali Bain's music, and we shared a delightful time listening to various pieces on his old tape recorder. Norm would occasionally share anecdotes from his life about his friends up north, including Angus MacLeod, or about the poets Solly MacLean or MacDermott and their visit to New York. Every man mentioned watching us silently from the pictures on the wall, while we were having a good time. You had the impression they wouldn't have minded to join in. But a lot he spoke about his favorite landscape, Ascent, about its mountains, or about creatures which he adored and celebrated in his poems. For example, many people connect his poetry with frogs, and Norman commented, I quote, I remember I was speaking to a school top form. The man who introduced me, an excellent fellow whom I knew, said something about MacCaigs images. He quoted me from a poem called Frogs, in which I say, they die on roads like Italian tenors. I've seen them like that. The trouble with images like that is every time I see an Italian tenor, I think of frogs. I could see the day departing, and when I left his house, I felt spellbound, my heart and head filled with stories, images, and witty remarks. You may think that I would have asked him about this or the other poem. I never did. I sense that we both acknowledge in the essential difference between a writer and a critic, that they perform different roles and should not mix. But they can meet and talk about life and poetry in general, as we love doing. So we never talked about any of his poems in particular, except some would come up and he would quote them. Over the years, we met quite regularly, and a sort of friendship blossomed from what he referred as our occasional meetings, until his passing at the age of 85 on the 23rd of January in 1996. Now, on his life, work, and the three phases of his work, let me give you more biographical detail about the man, which I will connect with his work and our interview if appropriate. Norman MacCaig was born in Edinburgh in 1910, as said, where he spent his entire life. He was married to Isabel Munro, a linguist known for her contribution to Oxford Dictionary of Current Idiomatic English, who died in 1990. He had a son and a daughter. His Gaelic ancestry made him consider himself a Gael, and he called himself a second-generation townie. He particularly loved Assynt in the northwest of Scotland, a region where he spent the summer months for over 40 years, as mentioned above. Many of his poems refer to Edinburgh, his hometown, where he lived all his life, and to this area being his spiritual home, as his good friend Ellie Bain named it in an article. He graduated in classics from the University of Edinburgh. Celtic descent and a classical education both had an important impact on his work. They made him aware of how essential a tight lyric form is, or as he puts it, I quote, if a poem is a complete poem, jam-packed full of statements, ideas, images, rhythms, which are all relevant to the theme of a poem, then it has got a form, no fat on it, no extra words. Kick them out if they're not earning their keep. End of quote. So you see where the title of my presentation today comes from. No extra words. It is a bit like a motto for MacCaig's art. His poems are clearly structured in rhyming stanzas, varied by sprung rhythms and assonance, and later in his work replaced by free verse. Another poetic feature of his work are his metaphors, as he regarded himself as a compulsive metaphor maker. He explains, I quote, I got it from my mother, who came from the Outer Hebrides, a little island called Sculpay. When she arrived in Edinburgh at the age of 16, she had no English at all, just Gaelic. She never learned to read or to write. She was illiterate, but she thought in metaphors and images all the time. She couldn't give us a row. She often wanted to, because she was a volatile lady, because inevitably she used an image which was so funny, we burst out laughing, and being volatile, she burst out laughing too. And so this is a genetic thing. Metaphors and images, I have to watch it in case I overload. An image comes into my head and I have to watch carefully. It's not suitable for this poem, away you go. I pick another one from the cluster. I do it even in conversation. I used to do it much more than I do it now because, as I said earlier, I'm a merciful man and I don't like to bamboozle people with metaphors and images. End of quote. As he said, he has to watch his wit and metaphors, which might either lead to flippancy or to rhetorical or obscure analogies. But let us hear a poem of Norman's, which depicts his aunt from Sculpay, where he spent some summer holidays as a child, a schoolboy from Edinburgh in rural Scotland on Sculpay.
Are we supposed to hear anything? Sorry, are we supposed to hear anything? Is somebody hearing anything, or it's only me that's not hearing anything?
I'm not hearing anything either.
Can you hear anything?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry about this. I stop it. Stop. I go back. On. My micro is on. I don't know what it is.
Could it be that you didn't do the switch when you did the sharing? You need to switch it to the right. Then the sound is included, because sometimes in the PowerPoints, the sharing means that it's not included.
Is it on top sound type?
You need to get out
Yeah.
again and do sharing again. Yeah.
Is it better now?
No, we can't hear anything. I think it's because you haven't shared the sound.
So I have to go back again.
Back again and then do the sharing.
Teilen beenden.
Yeah, time beenden, and there's a little switch to the right, which you just do. When it says another teilen, then you will see a little button. It says with sound.
Okay. Okay.
Got it? Good.
Got it, yeah.
Good, thank you.
Okay.
Right, try again.
Yeah. Sorry. Bildschirmpräsentation.
I couldn't answer her.
We hear it.
Understand her.
Good.
Aunt Julia spoke Gaelic very loud and very fast. I couldn't answer her. I couldn't understand her. She wore men's boots when she wore any. I can see her strong foot stained with peat paddling the treadle of the spinning wheel, while her right hand drew yarn marvellously out of the air. Hers was the only house where I've lain at night in the absolute darkness of a box bed, listening to crickets, being friendly. She was buckets and water flouncing into them. She was winds pouring wetly round house ends. She was brown eggs, black skirts, and a keeper of threepenny bits in a teapot. Aunt Julia spoke Gaelic very loud and very fast. By the time I had learned a little, she lay silenced in the absolute black of a sandy grave at Luscantire. But I hear her still, welcoming me with a seagull's voice across 100 yards of peat scrapes and lazy beds, and getting angry with so many questions unanswered. I'm sure.
Okay, one can imagine the impressive person of his Aunt Julia, whom he could not answer, since he spoke no Gaelic, and one can understand the boy's uneasiness in his lonely bed, listening to crickets, being friendly. In World War II, he was a conscientious objector, not for political or ideological reasons, but because, as he simply put it, I just didn't want to shoot other people, said in an interview with Tom Powell, a decision which sent him to prison. After the war, MacCaig worked as a schoolmaster at a primary school and later taught at the universities of Edinburgh and Stirling. He enjoyed the discussions in Miles Bar in Hanover Street 35 in Edinburgh, where in the 50s all prominent Scottish poets, including MacDermot, used to have a pint too, with fierce debates which may have gone on till the early hours and often in Norman's flat at Lamington Terrace. Today, Mills Bar is a tourist attraction with portraits on the wall of those poets. Some of you may know it. He received the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry in 1976 and the OBE in 1979. He taught some interviewers to fear his wit, which at the same time turned his numerous readings into popular events. His work has become part of the curriculum in Scottish secondary schools and universities. His popularity made the first edition of his collected poems a bestseller, a distinction very few poets can claim. MacCaig was not part of the Scottish Renaissance, a movement which arose in the 1920s and politicized the cultural independence of Scotland by pointing to her particular languages and literature. Though a close friend of MacDermot, the leading light of the movement, who used Lowland Scots Lowlands as his literary language, MacCaig always wrote in English, which brought him As Norman said, I quote, "the usual abuse, stabbing the Scottish movement in the back, a lickspittle of the English ascendancy." When I got to know them, they found out what a nice chap I am. So they had to modify all this. And he goes on, one of their spokesmen, an excellent man called Douglas Young, professor of classics, said, "It's a pity Norman doesn't write in Scots, but he's got a Scottish accent of the mind," whatever that means. I suppose anybody sensitive to poetry would know that the author of these poems is Scots. Altogether, our minds work, thank goodness, very differently from the minds of the English insofar as they think, insofar as they have minds. And he laughed. End of quote. With this information, you can already picture a man who relied on his strictly personal view, whatever the consequences, a characteristic strongly felt in his work as he strictly demands, talk about what you know. His poetry, characterized by a modesty that rejects grand gestures or any falsity, often revolves around universal themes such as love and death and the phenomena of time and memory, though presented in the context of everyday situations. He identifies what he describes as unemphatic marvels of the ordinary. He aims for the adequate and accurate representation of these moments in his poems, which he refers to as celebrations. His intention is to open the reader's eye to such everyday wonders. In this regard, he compares poetry to, quote, "a brisk dose of objects." He elaborates that poetry, I quote, "makes people see things what they have seen before but never really seen," emphasizing the process of perception itself. According to his principle of honesty, he wishes, and I quote, "to see things as they are," a statement he immediately diffuses by adding, "whatever that means," which highlights MacCaig's skeptical questioning of perception itself. What do I see? How can I do justice to an object that I can only perceive through my subjective view? Does my perception of something not already lead to its recreation? The question concerning the subject and object of perception can be seen as his central theme, the various aspects of which divide his work into three major phases, in my opinion. Here is a deeper look at these phases and their thematic elements. In the first phase of his work, from Riding Lights, published in 1955, to Measures, published in 1965, the poems often address the subjectivity of perception as such. Their strict metrical form, with regular rhyme schemes, progresses toward the subjective viewpoint at the poem's end. The presentation of precisely observed natural phenomena is followed by reflection of the poetic self, conveying the idea that humans are confined within their own perspectives. The controlled form conceals an intensive process of thought expressed through complex imagery reminiscent of metaphysical poetry. Because of this characteristic, Louis MacNeice has referred to MacCaig as, quote, "a metaphysical physical," an apt category for his first phase, where the acknowledged influence of the metaphysical poet John Donne is particularly recognizable in The Sinai Sword, published in 1957. The challenging metaphors in some poems from this phase have been rightly criticized as flippancy by literary critics. But now have him read Summer Farm.
Aunt Julia.
Ups.
Aunt Julia spoke Gaelic very loud. Aunt Julia.
Ups. Ei. Das ist doch nicht zu fassen. Das ist doch nicht zu fassen. Ups. Ups, was ist denn das jetzt?
Aunt Julia
Wie
spoke
geht's denn jetzt weiter? Oh. Probieren wir es mal so. Nee, das geht nicht. Eieieiei. Next one.
summer fire.
Ach, da haben wir es doch. Zurück. Look. Meine Güte.
You went forward. Okay.
Yeah,
just tell me.
yeah. I've got it. Okay,
Good.
good. Sorry. It's awful. Okay. Up. Wie gehe ich denn jetzt zurück? Jetzt habe ich es.
Aunt Julia.
Summer farm. Here we are. Sorry.
Summer farm. Straws like tame lightnings lie about the grass and hang zigzag on hedges. Green as glass, the water in the horse trough shines. 9 ducks go wobbling by in 2 straight lines. A hen stares at nothing with one eye, then picks it up. Out of an empty sky, a swallow falls, and flickering through the barn, dives up again into the dizzy blue. I lie, not thinking, in the cool, soft grass, afraid of where a thought might take me, as this grasshopper with plaited face unfolds his legs and finds himself in space. Self under self, a pile of selves, I stand, threaded on time, and with metaphysic hand lift the farm like a lid and see farm within farm, and in the centre, me.
Poem came up once in our conversation referring to the subjective view as such. I asked, so the process of vision means that everybody looks at things subjectively? And he answered, yes, you can't help it. What John Donne, the great poet, called our 5 ports of knowledge, the 5 senses. We all have that. And the kind of messages they deliver go up to the clever boy in the office up here. And he translates them into feeling, words, ideas, the whole lot. But since everybody is different, messages that come through the 5 ports aren't the same when they have been delivered. I wrote a poem which is very much like, except that the last verse bamboozles everybody. It's called Summer Farm. Well, it's about that very thing. There was myself looking at this farm, and I was looking at myself, really, or myself looking at it, and it's paying no damned attention. That's why the last verse often puzzles people. So I lift the farm like a lid and see farm within farm, in the center me. That is the meaning of that poem, in fact, and I'm always aware of this. End of quote. After the description of the lethargy on a summer farm, one follows the observer's thoughts in stanza 3 and his imaginative eye, which, like a photographic lens, mirrors its own point of view as phrased in the last lines. Lift the farm like a lid and see, farm within farm, and in the center, me. The poem comes to the conclusion that behind all the facts, the observer's subjective view remains as the only actual perception. So the poetic self turns into the object of perception, as the accusative case of the person pronoun me expresses, and its subjective view becomes the theme of the poem. In the second phase, from Surroundings, published in 1966, to The White Bird, published in 1973, the poetic self comments on the world around him right from the poem's beginning, often by addressing another. This shift marks a departure from isolated reflections to commentary on the external world, often with an ironic tone. The syntax breaks out of the rigid form, so the poem expresses a thought process that articulates itself in free verse based on well-balanced syntactic phrases and the repetition of words. The change of form corresponds to newly described places that reflect MacCaig's experiences in Italy and America. Many poems deal with poetological problems such as naming, the use of metaphors, the process of writing. The central thematic concern is how to render the objective world despite the subjective constraints. The second stage appears like a phase of revolt against the subjective limitations of perception, and sees MacCaig searching for new experiences and freer forms. MacCaig's characterization of MacCaig as apolitical is significant, since his poems do not comment on any political events. But according to him, he says, Norman says, I quote, "Poetry teaches a man to do more than observe mere factual errors and measurable truth. It trains him to have a shrewd nose for the fake, the inflated, the imprecise, and the dishonest. So it compels him to resist stock responses, because it compels him to examine the emotional significance as well as the rational significance of whatever comes under his notice." End of quote. Published in My Way of It by Chapman. That demand corresponds to his attitude, found more outspoken in the second phase of his work and further on, as can be related to the following poem, in which he fiercely criticizes injustice, especially when the poet encounters it personally, as in Assisi. Now, hopefully this is going to...
Summer Farm.
Here we are.
The dwarf, with his hands on backwards, sat, slumped like a half-filled sack on tiny twisted legs from which sawdust might run, outside the 3 tiers of churches built in honour of St. Francis, brother of the poor, talker with birds, over whom he had the advantage of not being dead yet. A priest explained how clever it was of Giotto to make his frescoes tell stories that would reveal to the illiterate the goodness of God and the suffering of his Son. I understood the explanation and the cleverness. A rush of tourists, clucking contentedly, fluttered after him as he scattered the grain of the word. It was they who had passed the ruined temple outside, whose eyes wept pus, whose back was higher than his head, whose lopsided mouth said grazie in a voice as sweet as a child's when she speaks to her mother, or a bird's when it spoke to St. Francis.
As a characteristic of the second stage, the poem employs free verse and is structured by alliteration, enchantement, and the repetition of words. A critical tone makes the lyrics felt right from the poem's beginning. Through vivid imagery and irony, MacCaig critiques the disconnection between the tourist experiences and the deeper moral imperatives tied to the historical and spiritual context of Assisi. In the first stanza, MacCaig reduces the figure of the beggar to a mere object, likening him to a sack or a puppet. This serves to highlight the callousness of tourists who see him as just another object of interest. The stark contrast with Assisi's rich architectural beauty raises a moral judgment against those who celebrate its grandeur while ignoring its true meaning, as it is compassion, as epitomized by the beggar and St. Francis, the brother of the poor. Moving to the second stanza, the tourists are the silent crowd amongst whom we encounter the lyric self, listening to a guide's, a priest's, long-winded explanations of Giotto's stories to instruct the illiterate about the depth of religious narratives. The effectiveness of the priest's instruction is left ambiguous, prompting the reader to question whether the spiritual enlightenment is achieved. In the last stanza, the analogy between the tourist and a flock of chickens creates a sickening irony. The biblical context made explicit by the capital letter in word ridicules the tourist's acceptance of the priest's explanations as the absolute truth. The priest's words are like grains with which he feeds his audience hunger for knowledge. The reference to chicken reminds us of St. Francis, talker with birds in stanza 1. Just as the saint speaks to the dumb animals, so the priest preaches to the tourists. They become the illiterate of stanza 2, who need his explanation and blindly believe all he says. The line, "It was they who had passed," utilizes an impersonal tone that emphasizes the tourist's disengagement from the beggar, further emphasizing their indifference despite the lessons they have just learned. The object they passed, the dwarf, is now described as the ruined temple. The metaphor ironically combines the biblical analogy of man's body as the temple of God with the reference to the beggar as an alien element in the Christian setting of Assisi, although this should be his very place according to the Christian ethic of compassion. The following relative clauses, constructed in parallel, enumerate the dwarf's wretched details, which underlie even further the speaker's criticism of the tourist's cruel indifference. It almost hurts to hear the beggar's voice speaking the foreign Italian word grazie, a disruptive note created by the sharp irony of his humble thanks for the tourist's aloofness. In the last lines, the enormous trust a child has for his mother or a bird for St. Francis, both dependent on the goodwill of others, is revealed in his small voice. In these comparisons, the irony reaches a climax, emphasizing the beggar's vulnerability and making the criticism of the tourist's cruel behavior loud and clear. The beggar embodies the essence of St. Francis' values, urging visitors to engage more fully with the legacy of compassion that the site represents. The irony deepens as tourists, despite their short-lived encounters with the religious teachings, remain largely unmoved. These are people who do not examine what they perceive and hear. They are not aware of the lesson the history of the place teaches them, so MacCaig attacks their stock response to Assisi. Assisi does not present a momentous event as in Summer Farm, but recounts a past occurrence. The free verse of MacCaig's second stage conveys the lyric self-critical attitude towards the seen world right from the poem's beginning. Thus, it is not the limited nature of subjective perception, but a personal comment on the world that is his center of interest. Just as MacCaig speaks to the injustices observed at Assisi, he also reflects upon Scottish history and the place he loves. In the only long poem, A Man in Ascent, published in A Man in My Position in 1969, his central concern, the question of property, is expressed by the repeated question, who owns this landscape, and gives the poem its shape and poignant theme. So he asks, I quote from the poem, or has it come to this, that this dying landscape belongs to the dead, the crofters and fighters and fishermen, to man trampled under the hoofs of sheep and driven by deer to the ends of the earth, to men whose loyalty was so great it accepted their own betrayal by their chiefs and whose descendants now are kept in their place by English businessmen and the indifference of a remote and ignorant government. End of quote. In this poem, he pillarized the foreign English rule over people who were driven away during the so-called clearances to make way for sheep and deer, leaving behind a dying landscape. These people were maltreated by their own chiefs and remained forgotten in the present by a remote government. The poem denounces the cruel ignorance of those who throughout history have neglected the crafters and fighters and fishermen, or willingly sacrificed their welfare for their own profit. An immediate response to injustices and cruelties illustrated by the poems is, for MacCaig, the only convincing one when he explains, "You really feel it in the immediate way that is necessary for the creation of a poem." Thus, Hugh McDermott's statement of MacCaig's lack of interest in politics seems to be not without justification. He has often been accused of his refusal to engage. MacCaig defends himself by stating, I quote, "It is all the more important in this sad world to notice and praise the good things that are still there." End of quote. So there is a dialectic in MacCaig's work. On the one hand, he celebrates the here and now, exclusively referring to his own experience in certain places. And on the other hand, he criticizes the history of humankind when he demands justice and humanity. We come now to the third phase, From the World's Room, published in 1974, to Voice Over, published in 1988. Subjective and objective qualities are connected in a lucid style that expresses the feelings and thoughts of the lyrical self. Here, Norman skillfully combines different techniques, including word repetition and free verse, with fixed stanzas and traditional imagery from the Bible or Greek myth. The utmost precision and conciseness of his language gives form to personal experience. In the poem End of Her Illness, Voice Over 1988, the happiness of a man receiving his wife back home after a serious illness is expressed through grotesque yet striking metaphors which convey the dismay of her disease and the intimacy of their reunion without slipping into sentimentality. Or the poem In Memoriam, published in The Equal Skies in 1980, is an example of the third stage. It also came up in our first interview. I asked, "Death doesn't mean the end of a relationship," and Norman answered, "Because of this marvelous thing, memory. One of these poems is about Angus, who was my closest friend ever. He was the head poacher up yonder. He was a close friend of the head gamekeeper. Typical. An excellent man." Let me read the poem. In Memoriam. On that stormy night, a top branch broke off on the biggest tree in my garden. It's still up there, though its leaves are withered black among the green. The living branches won't let it fall. Then he said, "People who survive remember it. All these leaves are withered. Memory fascinates me, though I don't know how it works. I don't know how mine works because it's so eccentric. But memory is the mother of the muses, as the Greeks said." End of quote. The poem is characteristic for the third stage in that it presents a real experience, a stormy night, which seems to reach beyond itself only. Oh, I forgot. Sorry. I've got it here. Yeah. Which seems to reach beyond itself only because of the poem's title and its being part of the collection Poems for Angus, written on the occasion of a close friend's, Angus MacLeod's, passing. The natural event of a storm symbolizes upheaval, reflecting the internal struggle that accompanies grief. The breaking branch serves as a beautiful metaphor for the loss. Just as the branch is cut off its tree, the speaker feels a profound separation from his friend. This extended metaphor expresses the subjective experience of the death of a very dear friend and the understanding of loss, suggesting that while physical presence may be lost, the essence of memory remains unbroken. Norman describes his concern with death in a more personal way of writing when he says, I quote, "An awful lot of my poems are celebration. I think I probably told you. There have been more sad ones in the last 2-3 books. I probably told you why. Friends died, close friends, and you never get over that. So there are more sad things in the more recent books than there used to be, which I'm rather glad about because it enabled me to write more emotionally out of myself than I used to be able to. There is a big streak of reticence in me. I think everybody has the perfect right to keep their mouth shut about anything they want to keep their mouths shut about." End of quote. As a final point, let me highlight a few connections that stand out from MacCaig's literary context. He acknowledges 2 influences on his writing, the metaphysical John Donne, as mentioned above, whose impact can be found particularly in the witty poems of the first phase, and the American poet Wallace Stevens, whose dialectic between a world of imagination and the real world can be linked with MacCaig's concept of perception. Yet the Scotsman never loses contact with a clear sense of the concrete. His control of emotion and his love of everyday scenes remind the reader of Philip Larkin's poetry. His preference for precise language in everyday speech connects him with the images, and especially with William Carlos Williams' celebration of the ordinary. His mistrust of the possibilities of language and his awareness of the fundamental inability to grasp the outer world in its particularities place MacCaig within a general tendency in international post-war poetry. His personally detached position that he takes in his poetry differentiates him strongly from the self-analytical stance of the confessional poets. He was a close friend to Seamus Heaney, as well as to many contemporary Scottish poets. Despite being one of the outstanding Scottish poets of the last century and the recipient of many literary prizes, including the Queen's Gold Medal for Poetry, Norman MacCaig has, on the whole, remained internationally overlooked. In his 80s, MacCaig could reflect on a life's work that shines in its variety of themes and well-balanced poetic forms. His poems are characterized by a style that formulates personal concern as well as profound thinking in such a way that they encourage the reader to look more closely, whether the context is the sleepy scenery in Summer Farm or a beggar in Assisi. Thus, reading MacCaig provides both literary and personal pleasure and enrichment. One can only hope that this work gains the attention it deserves. Let me end with a personal remark. To me, Norman MacCaig will always be part of my life. And it was a great joy, although he disliked academics, that he saw me more as a friend. I miss him, his sense of humor, our meetings, his wit, and the way of speaking, when he expressed in 3 sentences what often needed essays for, his fierce wit and his love of life's unemphatic marvels. He opened my eyes to them forever. How fortunate and thankful I feel to have met him. Now I have a last, short bibliography. It's very, very short. It's only basically his books. And the secondary literature I use is actually only this interview. And here's my dissertation, Norman MacCaig's lyrisches Werk, as mentioned before, a short biography of myself. And let me thank you all for your attention. And I'm awfully sorry for my technical disabilities. Thank you very much.